Alright guys, welcome to our first audio lecture. As you can tell from the title, today's lesson is going to be about primary and secondary sources. So before we get started, I want to kind of go over a couple of objectives for today's lesson. In this case, the first objective is to understand what are primary sources, as well as understanding and knowing what are secondary sources. Number two is we're going to focus on the differences between primary and secondary sources, and then lastly, by the end of the lecture, we'll have a better understanding of the importance of using both primary and secondary sources. So our first question is, what is a primary source? A primary source is a document or physical object which was written or created during the time under study. More importantly, these documents or objects were produced by an individual or individuals who participated in or witnessed the actual event. Primary sources are a first-hand account of what has happened in the past. The individual who is creating the primary source, whether it be a memoir or a letter or a diary, actually was at the actual event. They have a first-hand account of what actually happened, and it's important to understand that these individuals didn't hear this story or didn't encounter this event secondhand. They didn't hear from it after the event happened, or they didn't read about it in the paper. More importantly, this individual or individuals was actually there when this actually took place. So once again, it's that first-hand account of what happened. Primary sources also can be written well after the event has occurred. In this case, the idea of memoirs or oral histories. As historians, we often rely on memoirs or oral histories that are created by individuals who actually witnessed the event, but do not write about the event until, or even talk about the event until a later date. So, what is a memoir? In this case, a memoir is an account of someone's experience written by that actual individual. Once again, it's that individual talking about their experience during a particular event. So in this example that we have on the screen, we have a memoir that was published by a gentleman by the name of Elie Wiesel. It's his memoir about his experience in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And this, like I said, this is an example of a memoir that was written 10 years after Elie had survived the horrific event of the Holocaust. He wrote this event once again 10 years after he was liberated, and it's his personal experience that he's expressing through the pages of his memoir. It's important to understand that memoirs, like I said, are a person's first-hand account, but memoirs are not just the only type of primary source that historians use. And this is important to understand that primary sources are not just limited to just documents. We have political cartoons, we have music, or even the original design of a building. These are all examples of primary sources. Whether it's the music of a time period or even a particular photograph. Once again, these primary sources are created by individuals during that particular time period under study. But one thing I want to focus on, I want to stop and talk about real quickly, is I want to focus on the difference between an autobiography and a biography. Well, first thing is a autobiography is an example of a primary source because it's a book that is about an individual's life. And it's it is written by that individual. Okay, it's their individual. That individual's life written in the form of a book. Whereas a biography is a book about a person's life that is written by someone else besides that individual person. So like I said, just wanted to clarify the difference between an autobiography and a biography. Well, primary sources offer a variety of points of view and perspectives of events, people, places, as well as issues. Right now we have two political cartoons, and they both are primary sources about FDR, or in this case Franklin Roosevelt. What I would like for you to do right now is take a couple of minutes and analyze both of the images, or both of the political cartoons. Look at the similarities between the two, or more importantly, look at the differences. Because if you look very closely, there is a difference in perspective in regards to how the cartoonist viewed the role of President Roosevelt. So like I said, I'm going to pause for maybe about 10 seconds to give you a chance to look at it. If you need to, you can go ahead and pause your computer right now so you can sit down and analyze these two sources. Alright, one of the things that you should have noticed, or one of the things that you should focus on when looking at these two primary sources, is looking at the cartoonist and what they have depicted about FDR in the form of a cartoon. Both cartoons vary in regards to how they view FDR and his role in solving the Great Depression. Now, it's important to understand that by analyzing primary sources, it allows the viewer to have an idea of what it was like to live in the past. If you look at the picture, it kind of gives the viewer the idea that at one particular point in time in American history, that African Americans and whites were segregated in public places. So throughout the year, like I said, we're going to look at several primary sources, a lot of photos, a lot of political cartoons to give us an idea of what life was like in the past. So we've already talked about primary sources. Now let's take the time to talk about what are secondary sources. So a secondary source is something that was written about a primary source. This type of source was created by someone who did not actually experience the actual event firsthand, or even participated in the actual event, or in the event of the past. So right here we have an example of a secondary source. The name of the secondary source is A Team of Rivals, the political genius of Abraham Lincoln. And so what we can conclude from this book is that in order for this author to create this book, or to write this book, it's important to understand that this author didn't know Abraham Lincoln personally, nor did this individual or this actual author live during the time period which Abraham Lincoln was alive. But in order to write this secondary source, this author had to analyze primary sources. So they had to rely on speeches of Abraham Lincoln, or letters, or even diaries that Abraham Lincoln created. Once again, secondary sources rely on primary sources to tell what has happened in the past. It's a close analysis of these primary sources. So in regards to secondary sources, usually the author of a secondary source will have studied the primary source of a historical period or an event, and then will interpret the evidence found in the primary sources. So in this particular case, we have an example of the textbook. In this case, a textbook is an example of a secondary source. The title for this one is Retracing the Past. Retracing the Past. So in regards to this textbook, a team of historians have been have sat down and actually were involved in a comprehensive analysis of a compilation of primary sources as well as secondary sources in order to create this textbook. They use both primary and secondary sources to pick and choose the events, the major events that they wanted to include in this particular textbook. Some examples of secondary sources are dictionaries, encyclopedias, textbooks, biographies, as well as articles that review other sources. Once again, please understand the difference between an autobiography and a biography. Remember that a biography is a book about a person's life written by another person. So this takes us to the last two slides of our lecture, and we're going to focus now on 4 historical thinking skills that we're going to focus on throughout the year. In regards to the first one, we're going to be talking about sourcing. We want to consider who created the source under examination as well as the circumstances of its creation. Okay, we want to truly focus on when and why this particular source was created. The next particular skill that we're going to focus on is close reading. Basically, we're talking about the evaluation of sources and the analysis of its contents. We want to think about what language or words or phrases, images, symbols, or symbols does the author use in order to express his or her thoughts. The next particular skill that we're going to talk about this year, or we're going to use this year, is contextualization. We're going to be locating a particular source in a time period and a place to understand how these factors shape its content. It's important to understand that for every document or every primary source that was created, it's important to understand the context of which it was created. It's very important to understand, like I said, how this basically shaped the contents within the actual document. And then the last skill that we're going to focus on throughout the year is the skill of corroboration. When we're talking about this particular skill, we're going to be considering the details from across multiple sources. We want to look at different sources throughout different forms of sources, whether it's a political cartoon or a speech or a poem or a diary. But we want to look at what do other sources say about the source that we're studying right now. More importantly, we're looking at being able to find other sources that either agree or disagree with the contents or disagree with the perspective that is shown in that particular primary or secondary source. So what? What is the big idea? What is important to understand about this? To help us understand what has happened in the past, historians use various forms of primary resources, whether it's charts, diagrams, maps, graphs, songs, and even books. But also it's important to understand that historians also use secondary sources to help us today develop a better understanding of what has happened in the past.